Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today on this build. Here in SketchUp I have modeled this small bench that I'm planning on making. It's a little bit more modern of an influence. I made this design myself in SketchUp, but it was heavily influenced by a few different ones that I saw online. You can see it's a pretty small bench in comparison to the human model that they have there in SketchUp. It's really meant to just have one person sitting on it at a time. Here you can see it's a bit more of a modern influence. It's going to have these long stretchers that connect the angled legs from left to right there, and then two small stretchers on each side that connect the front legs to the back legs. Additionally, the seat there on the top is going to have a curved radius on the outside edges of it. I'm building this bench out of white oak, mainly riftsawn, but the seat itself is going to be quartersawn. We'll get more into that later. The lumber that I picked up for this is S4S, meaning that it's surfaced on all four sides, which luckily for me means minimal milling for this whole project. I'm starting out here by taking the legs and ripping them on the table saw to their widest part. Next I'm taking the legs over to the planer where I can plane them down to their final thickness, which is 1 inch. Because of the different angles on this bench, I'm going to be using my miter gauge quite a bit. The miter gauge allows you to make crosscuts on different pieces of wood, but you can set different angles for them so that they're not exactly 90. So here you can see me setting 9 degrees for the legs. This is going to be to cut the foot, and this is going to be what angles the leg in initially. And once I have that dialed in, I can repeat that cut on all 4 legs. Alright, here's one of the ends that I just cut. There's the 9-degree angle on that leg. So now for what the plans call for, I went from this edge up 18 inches, marked that out, came up to this face for it, drew another 9-degree angle for the top of the leg, and then I continued that on square over onto the other edge. So what I'm going to actually do at this point is I'm going to flip this end for end so that I can keep the same reference edge on my miter gauge, and I'm actually going to adjust the miter gauge, and I'm going to turn it 18 degrees this way. So it'll take me 9 degrees back to square and then another 9 degrees. That'll give me that angle that I'm looking for on that part. In this clip you can see that I'm using the stop block feature on the end of the miter gauge as well. That guarantees that all the legs are the exact same length, which you can see in this shot here. Next I measured and marked out on the legs where I needed the taper for them to go, which you can faintly see in this shot. Once I had that, I went over and set that up on my taper sled on my table saw in order to cut those. By having the fence set on the taper sled there, I'm able to recreate that same exact taper on all 4 legs to make sure that they're identical with each other. Here in this shot you can see that I'm cutting a fresh edge on a 1/4 inch thick piece of cherry plywood for a sled that I'm going to make for my next cut. The angle that the leg requires next I can't achieve with either the taper sled or the miter gauge. Right there you can see where it's marked out. And essentially what I'm going to do is use this 1/4 inch thick piece of plywood as a sled. So I have the leg marked out exactly where I need it along that fresh edge that I just cut. And now I'm going to put tape around the outside of it. Really what this is going to end up being is a CA glue trick, which I'm a huge fan of. I use them on almost every single project. And what this is going to allow me to do is to create a temporary sled so that I can get that repeated cut on all the legs. After putting that glue down, all I need to do is spray a little bit of activator on this tape covered block, hold it in place for about 15 seconds with some moderate hand pressure, and it's going to be securely fastened to that sled, at least temporarily. So I'm going to do this with all of the different blocks and essentially create those positive stops so I can get those cuts. And here you can see how that cut at the top of the legs is uniform for all 4 pieces. The great thing about this trick is that it only holds things in place temporarily, so here you can see me peeling everything off, so this piece of plywood is going to be perfectly usable for another project in the future. Alright, now that the legs are dimensioned, I'm going to work on the joinery for them that I'm going to need for the long stretchers that are going to run from the right side over to the left side. So for that I had to do a little bit of math here and figure this out. I've got the legs sketched up here roughly, and then here's going to be the stretcher that runs across there and connects it to the other side.
So the issue that I have right now is that I need to do the joinery for that, which I'm going to use floating tenon and then do mortises on each side of the stretcher and the leg. And the issue I have right now is because of this angle on the leg, if I were to use that as my reference face to plunge the mortise, instead of getting the mortise to go across like this that I want, it would come in at an angle right there and it would be 90 degrees from this face. So in order to remedy that, what I'm going to do is create a shim so that I can get that to be the angle that I want. And I know that's going to be a 12-degree angle based off of the measurements from my plans. So I'm going to make that 12-degree shim right now. So before doing that with the domino, I wanted to point out that there's other ways that you could do this complex mortise too. One of the other ways that I considered doing it was over here at my drill press. Ideally, what I would just have to do at that point is create a 9-degree shim using the same method that I just showed. Prop that up underneath of here, and then you could have a fence clamped down to your drill press table like this. And then ideally, you would have a hollow chisel mortiser or an end mill bit, and you would just keep plunging and move that along and continue to plunge the mortise until you had that fully out. I consider doing this, but ultimately because I have the domino, I'm going to go with that method.
I marked out on the leg where I want the mortise to go, made my 12-degree shim, and I have a stop block for the shim to attach to the leg. Now I can use my domino to plunge those mortises in the leg, referencing off both the shim and the front of the leg. I've never seen anyone else use this technique before with a domino of using a shim to adjust the angle of the mortise, but to me I didn't see any problem doing it, and it actually worked out perfectly. The only downside is you lose a little bit of plunging depth, but for a project this size that wasn't an issue for me. With the leg sizing and initial joinery cut, I decided to start focusing on the stretchers now. I took this stock for that over to the table saw and started ripping them down to their final dimensions. With that complete, I then took the pieces and looking at the color and grain on them, I figured out which pieces I wanted where and labeled them. Next, I went back to the table saw with my crosscut sled and a stop block to make the lengthwise cuts for all the stretchers, and here I'm just showing the short ones. All right, at this point, I've got my two legs here and I have my stretcher cut to the final length for it. So if you remember, I plunged those dominoes into the legs to make those mortises using that 12-degree wedge. So because of that, the mortise that I plunged is not perpendicular to the face here, but it's actually perpendicular to the vertical component of the legs. So for that reason, before I go and I cut the 12-degree angle to match on the stretcher here, I'm going to plunge the mortise going in laterally this way, and then after that, I'll do the cut. So once again, it's back to the miter gauge, this time set at 12 degrees to make the cut on the long stretcher. After that, I flip the stretcher end for end using my stop block to guarantee that they both stay the same length. Then I can cut the second side. With both stretchers done, I did a quick dry fit test with the legs to make sure everything lined up, and fortunately they did. All right, I've got my positions marked out for where the short stretchers are going to go between the front legs and the back legs. For this lower one right here, it's super simple. It's just going to be a rectangular short stretcher that goes in that spot. But for this top one, because of the angle that the leg is splayed out at, you can see this makes it so that it's not a 90-degree corner right there. It's actually going to be a 9-degree angle. So now I'm going to take those stretchers over to the table saw, tilt the blade to 9 degrees, and we'll make that cut. And here you can see that angle and how it fits in on the leg. Next, it was time to plunge the mortises for the short stretchers with the domino. While the domino is pretty easy to use, you do have to carefully lay out where you want to plunge and adjust your fence settings carefully. I'll admit, I've been pretty lazy with using the domino for mortise and tenon joinery recently. On my next project that requires it, I'll definitely show other means of doing it, mainly with a table saw and router. With all the mortises plunged, I once again do a dry fit and everything is looking good. At this point, I decided to start in on the bench seat itself, cutting that to 36 inches. Earlier I mentioned how this bench is both riftsawn and quartersawn. The base is predominantly riftsawn, which gives it those really straight grain lines you probably noticed earlier. But for the top, I'm using quartersawn white oak, which means the board was sawed so that the growth rings are perpendicular to the face of the board. In white oak, this often results in a feature called rayfleck, which you can see here. I'm really happy with how those boards look, but I have an issue with the gap where they'll be glued up. Ironically, my joiner isn't the best for actually joining boards this size, and neither has an opposite edge straight enough to reference off on the table saw fence. So once again, I'm returning to my tape and CA glue trick, and I put tape on both the boards, put glue on one side and activator on the other, and fold the boards together along that future glue joint. Then it's back to the table saw where I put the boards on the taper sled, this time orienting them just to get a slight straight cut to create a straight edge on each. I also swapped out my saw blade to a rip cut blade for this in order to guarantee the best possible result. The only downside to that CA glue and tape trick is sometimes you can accidentally overdo it, and it's a pain to get the two pieces back apart, as you can see I'm struggling with here. Fortunately, I get it all apart, and this is the much more serviceable glue joint I have afterwards. Then it was time for the glue up. This was pretty straightforward, but the great thing about that book matching technique when joining those edges was that even if the angle of the saw was off slightly, by having them folded in on each other, you guarantee the boards will glue up to be flat. While the seat is drying, I take the top short stretchers over to the drill press and drill in a series of holes. This will be where the screws go that connect the seat to the base of the bench. The holes are elongated to allow the screws to move for seasonal expansion and contraction of the seat, but because that's quarter sawn, I'm really not expecting it to move very much at all seasonally. It comes out a little bit rough, but I can easily clean that up with some files off camera. With all my long and short stretchers dimensioned, I can now take them over to the router table, and here I have a roundover bit chucked up in there, which is going to give them a nice smooth rounded over profile on all the corners. For the legs, because of where the joinery was located for that, I didn't want quite as aggressive of a roundover, so I decided to do that by hand on the inside of the legs with my block plane here. At this point off camera too, I took all the legs and stretchers and sanded them up through the grits to 180 in preparation for the glue up. I'm going to glue up the base in two stages, starting with the long stretchers. Here I have angled blocks taped to the legs to help provide good clamping pressure. I'm going to use another tape trick for the entirety of the glue up of this base. Here you can see I'm taking some of that green painter's tape, putting it over where the mortise from the domino is going to go, and then cutting out a spot for the domino to go back in. At this point, I'm going to dry assemble the whole thing and clamp it up again. With everything clamped in place, I'm going to come back with a box cutter and lightly score the tape where the stretchers meet the leg. Then I come back in with the same box cutter to carefully remove that tape around each of the mortises on the legs. The reason that I'm doing this right now is so that when I glue the base up, any of the glue squeeze out that comes out of those mortises will flow onto the tape, which is easily removable from the legs and the stretchers. This is going to save me a lot of time post glue up where I would have to come back and clean up that glue off of the legs and the stretchers. Once the first part of the base was dry, I marked halfway through the thickness of the legs and took them to my router table where I set up a large 3/4 inch radius roundover bit to make a thumbnail profile on the outside of the legs. I decided to make this in two passes, raising the bit in between. For the second pass, I compared the bearing against the line I marked and made sure the bottom of the bearing was just barely referencing off that line. I had some scrap offcuts from the legs, so I decided to do a couple trial passes on those to make sure the bit was set up correctly. Here you can see that I've got that thumbnail profile I'm looking for where it's rounded over the top, but I have those crisp corners on the side. Once everything was set up correctly, I came back with my legs themselves and made the final pass. And thankfully that thumbnail profile turned out just the way I wanted it to. With that thumbnail profile complete, I could then move on to the second stage of the glue up for the base, and here you can see I'm employing that same tape trick that I used on the first stage of the glue up. Here's how that looks all glued up. And here's how it looks once it's dried, out of clamps and with the tape removed. With the base fully constructed, now I just needed to work on the seat and the project would be done. Initially, I put my rip cut blade back into my table saw and then ripped this down to its final width before putting my crosscut blade back in and using my crosscut sled cut it to its final length of about 36 inches. Now I just need to round over the ends of the bench as the plans called for, so I'm going to basically make a template for this, taking another piece of plywood that I have here, and I'm going to use that CA glue trick again. Apparently I got lazy, didn't want to put any tape down for this, so I just took these scrap blocks, glued them in place, and basically it made cleats on either side. Here I marked the center of the board and then transferred that line down to my template. With the seat removed, I could then come in and transfer that line to the top part of my template and then trace that back. So I think I traced back about 7 inches or so, made an X, and then I put this double-sided carpet tape down, and then I put down the pivot point for the circle cutting jig on my router. So here you can see I'm just using my plunge router and going back and forth, and it's going to make that rounded profile for my template. With that done, I come back with a flathead screwdriver and remove the pivot point for that circle cutting jig and that double-sided tape. Because I couldn't cut all the way to the sides because of those blocks, I just took my template over to the bandsaw and cut off the excess. Using the cleats as a guide, I put the seat back into the template, flushed it up with the front, and then I traced out lines for the rounded over profile on the bottom. I then took my combination square and I made sure it was even on both sides, and fortunately it was. I then took the seat over to the bandsaw and used that to cut just outside of the line, cutting off all of the excess that I could. Because the video is sped up and the angle this is shot at, it looks like my hand is much closer to the blade than it actually was, and I promise it was perfectly safe. With that, I clamped the seat back up into the template, clamped it to the table, and out of frame I have some weight on the back end helping to support that. Here you can see that the seat is overhanging the template just by a little bit. So whenever you're using a router in this configuration with the router above the workpiece and you're working on the edge of the piece, you always want to go from left to right to the max extent possible. Over on this side, that's totally fine because I'm coming in here, going across the grain, and then as I'm coming over here, I start to run into a little bit of an issue. Especially with this being white oak likes to splinter a lot and it likes to tear out and break out. So the problem is if I come in here and the cutter is pushing against this, when I get to the end, there's a significant chance that when I get here, instead of just cutting a clean line, it's going to chip out a significant portion of the white oak on this end. So what I'm going to do is come all the way across, and when I get to about maybe the last half inch, 3/4 of an inch, I'm going to do what's called a climb cut, which is where I'm going to take it back, come in over on this side, and then come in through this end. This can be a little dangerous if you're taking off a lot of material, but honestly, I think that I have so little material that I'm going to be taking off here. As long as I'm really careful, it'll turn out fine. So here cutting that first end, everything went perfectly fine, including the climb cut. And honestly, the second half wasn't all that dramatic either, but you'll see in just a second why that climb cut can be dangerous. So as I'm coming back here, you'll see the router jerk for a second there from left to right. That's the danger with the climb cut. It can grab onto the wood and you can lose control of it really quickly if you're not careful. With that thumbnail profile complete on the ends of the seat, it was time for the final sanding and round over details of the seat. So here I'm using a technique that I employ pretty frequently where I draw in pencil lines as I'm going up through the grits, and when I've sanded through on each grit, I know I've sanded adequately. On the ends, it's way easier to just hand sand that up to 180 as opposed to trying to balance the random orbit sander on it. so that's what I elected to do there. I could have also gone back over to the router to give the round over detail on the corners here, but instead I decided to use my block plane once again and then to sand over by hand to get the round over detail that I wanted on the seat. And lastly, before finish, it was time to put my brand on there, and I chose to do this on the bottom of one of the feet. So I was actually torn between two different finishes that I wanted to do for this, both of which were Rubio Monocoat, but on the right here is the pure version. That's what I use on most of my projects, and I'm usually pretty happy with that. I actually haven't done a whole lot of projects with white oak recently, so one of the other things that I was toying with that I was reading online is a lot of people talking about using the natural finish, which is the one on the left there. It doesn't darken and amber the wood quite as much as the pure, and here you can see the comparison, and maybe it's harder to tell on camera, but it's pretty significant, the color difference. So ultimately, after looking at those sample pieces, I elected to go with the pure one, the one that was on the right that was a little bit darker in color. And if I'm being completely honest, I kind of regret that a little bit. I still love the way the project ultimately turned out, and I'm pretty happy with it. But once I put the finish on, it darkened and ambered it in a way that to me kind of made it look a little bit more reminiscent of red oak than white oak. If you look at the grain, you can still definitely tell that it's white oak, especially with that ray fleck profile here on the seat. But I don't know, I'm a little bit torn. Let me know in the comments what you would have done. Do you think it looks good as is, or would you have gone for the lighter, more natural finish? Despite any slight regrets, I was still really happy to see how this Rayfleck came alive when I put that oil finish on. This is one of my favorite parts of any project, of putting that oil on, or whatever the finish is, and just really seeing the project come to life. Lastly, once the finish dried, the only thing left to do was to attach the base to the top, which I'm doing here. I have everything turned upside down, and I'm just using my combination square to make sure that everything is evenly spaced. Once I do that, I take one of the brass screws that I'm going to use to attach it, and then I take a Sharpie and I Sharpie in the tip of it. With everything in place, I then take the screw and I just put it down the center of the hole where it's going to attach to the seat, and then I just push down with hand pressure into where it should attach. And then I do that for all of the 4 spots where the screws are going to connect. With the base removed, I can see these small black dots from where the screws transferred the Sharpie to the underside of the seat, and I know where to pre-drill. I didn't realize it, but when I used the drill press to drill the holes for the screws to go through, that I drilled it at that 9-degree angle, which isn't a big deal because now I just need to pre-drill at a slight angle going through the top. So here I'm just making a flag using masking tape, making sure that I don't drill all the way through the seat. Once that tape flag gets close to the surface of the seat, I know it's time to stop pre-drilling. Then I can finally attach the base to the seat, and here you can see I was off probably a little bit with my pre-drilling because the screws are so far offset, but honestly I'm not really that concerned about it, and it's close enough. And with that, the project was finished. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. This is my laundry room where the bench was always intended to go. This door right here leads out to my wood shop, so the intent of this was always to be a spot that as I'm coming and going, I could take my shoes off and on, so as to avoid tracking dirt through the remainder of the house. If you like this video, I plan on having more like it in the near future, so please consider liking and subscribing to see more of that content. Thank you.